Okay, so why don't we begin? I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is John Blakinger, and I'm an associate professor of art history in the School of Art here at the University of Arkansas. And it is my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Scott Manning Stevens. Professor Stevens is an associate professor of English, art and music history and religion, and is also the director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University. Professor Stevens studies the Native American cultures of the Northeast from the pre-colonial period to the present, with a special interest in visual culture, museum studies, and Native American literatures. He holds a PhD from Harvard and has held many prestigious fellowships, including a Fulbright scholarship, which is why he's visiting us today from Hungary. Professor Stevens has authored essays on a wide range of topics, from the art of the American West and Lewis and Clark's Indian artifacts to the politics of display at the National Museum of the American Indian. Today, his lecture is on the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer's Portraits of Indigenous Americans. The talk is titled Karl Bodmer's Ethnographic Eye. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scott Manning Stevens.
Thank you very much. Sego Skanago. That's a Mohawk greeting from my nation. I'm a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation. And Sego Skanago means that I hope it is still the great peace with you and that you are at peace, in balance, have a good mind. And I like to start out by saying that because I genuinely hope in these troubling times that it is true for most of you. I'm also really pleased to be addressing people who, many of you living in the ancestral homelands of the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations. And it means a lot to me to think of that place, some of its difficult history, not only with Indian removal and Native people coming through on the Trail of Tears, but also the position of Indigenous people still living in the region and trying to have their voices heard. So I want to acknowledge them before I start my talk. So my talk today is on the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer, who you just heard about. And I don't know how many people know Karl Bodmer's work in advance of this, so I want to give you some background as we go along, and why I'm talking about Bodmer in particular. The last couple years, I've been doing research and writing on Bodmer in preparation for a catalog essay for an upcoming exhibit, fingers crossed. We hope the exhibit will open at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in April of this year, 2021. And it will feature primarily the watercolors and portrait in watercolor that Bodmer made during his stay in the interior of North America in 1832 through 1834. So who is this guy? Let me see if I can advance this. So Karl Bodmer, he is the larger of those two pictures. The one by Mcrae of Bodmer in his much advanced age. Keep in mind throughout this that the Bodmer who produces the artwork we're going to look at is only 23 when he comes to the United States. He is really green as an artist, as a young man. He certainly almost never traveled very far outside of Switzerland, his native country, or the part of Germany bordering it, where he made his fledgling career as an artist of local landscapes. So landscape art was popular in the early 19th century. It was popular to buy etchings of a kind of picturesque version of the landscape in which you lived. His brother provided the etchings. He was trained as a draftsman in pencil and watercolor. So he would do these beautiful pictures of the Moselle River Valley and the Rhine His brother would turn them into etchings, and they would sell them. And that was apparently what brought him to the attention of Prince Maximillian von Wied-Neuwied. Maximilian von Wied-Neuwied was a minor German aristocrat living in the area near Koblenz, and he was a great fan of the adventurer, scientist, explorer Alexander von Humboldt, who some of you may know, who had famously made his journey through South America, written a kind of, epoch-making book on natural history and geography. And Maximilian was in awe of this figure and had very romantic notions of wanting to do the same type of thing. And after he finished university, he promptly went to Brazil in the 1815 to 1817 period and traveled and kept notes and wrote a journal account of his travels there when he returned. But he was criticized for having not had a professional illustrator with him to make a visual account of this. And he had supplied some of his own drawings, but they were fairly amateur. I mean, not terrible, but they weren't up to the standard that his readers wanted. And he felt somewhat burned by that experience. So he planned another trip a few decades later, this time to the interior of North America, mostly with the idea of exploring the region of what we would call the Western frontier, and pretty much taking the path that Lewis and Clark had followed up the Mississippi to the Missouri River, and the Missouri far up into the northern plains, into what is now Montana. So over a 1,400-mile journey into the interior. And just in terms of understanding, we have to have a sense of the kind of context for the art that we're going to talk about, because the American frontier is a mobile thing. Remember, at one point, the frontier is Indiana and Illinois during the early Republic. And you'll still have herds of buffalo as far east as Illinois. And that they will recede, of course, with settler advancement into those territories. And you have a kind of either a very romanticized notion of Native people, like here in Titian Peale's print of a buffalo hunt, or you have what was more typical in the first years of the early Republic, a real demonization of Native people in the visual arts of this country. Very famous painting, I would say infamous painting, by John Vanderlyn, American painter, The Murder of Jane Mcrae. It's from an event in history that took place during the American Revolution, but he paints it in the early 1800s and displays it in France, where it's very popular. And it really, you can see, it emphasizes savagery, brutality, the kind of animalistic cruelty of Native people, the woman, very pale compared to them, supine, and about to be tomahawked, presumably scalped in the story. These pictures were frequently reproduced as etchings, passed around as a kind of public memorial of figures like that, but they also had the task of justifying violence and removal of Indigenous people. Because if this is what you were raised thinking Indigenous people were up to, then hearing accounts of their being forced out of the country, forced west, forced onto reservations, probably didn't seem too extreme to you. There's also the romantic notion of the vanishing Indian, which is an ever popular notion of Native peoples as somehow inevitably doomed to disappear. And look at the date of this, 1847. there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native Americans in that year. And yet, here's Tompkins Matson, a New York painter, painting this family group, presumably the last of the race, driven to the edge of the continent, facing the sea. I mean, it doesn't represent any kind of reality for Indigenous people at the time, not demographically, even politically. But I would call this what I've termed elsewhere as aspirational vanishing. We hope they're going. And it has this sense of, I always focus on that term vanishing because I think it's such a creepy term because it has this, there's no real agent of vanishing. The question is who vanished the Indians, not why. It's not a magic trick we're up to, vanishing, but it leaves it kind of without any culprit. And so in 1847, well, one of the reasons they seem to be vanishing from the East is that in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act that said all Native people living east of the Mississippi must be removed west of it. So there's some reason for vanishing. But so you have us Native peoples are caught between either being demonized as savages, which justifies violence towards us, or kind of romantically and nostalgically looked at as inevitably doomed, as though, there's just nothing we can do to help them. That Native people and civilization, so-called, can't occupy the same space and time on this continent. And this is part, I just chose one of the more very obvious ones, but there are hundreds of paintings and sculptures of dying Indians, vanishing Indians. Think of the last of the Mohicans. It's of the same idiom, right? It wants there to be a last of, and Americans have a kind of interest and favor towards last full-blood chief, last speaker, last traditional medicine man, all the last of, right? The lasting of Native people is a consistent problem through our history. And it's right there to be seen in our visual history. Just in case you're not a reader and you're not going to pick up a book on this, you don't have to, because there are hundreds of images around you to show just what this means. But back to Prince Maximillian and Bodmer. So he chooses Bodmer as his official illustrator, a young 23-year-old man with, I should point out, no training whatsoever in portrait painting or even just basic human anatomy drawing. He's been trained by his uncle as a landscape painter. And in his early works that survive, if there are figures, they're just tiny little figures on a horizon, but there's no articulation of them. And so the fact that he's going to be expected to do all these portraits of Indigenous people is kind of remarkable, because he's learning his craft in the field, as it were. And I think that's partly what's remarkable about his achievement. The other thing that I think one should be aware of with Bodmer is he has an enduring legacy in art history of somehow representing a window into the real past, meaning we don't necessarily look at that Tompkins Matson painting and worry about how accurate his depictions are of those people. But when we get to Bodmer, you get a lot of, quite well-educated people looking at them and treating them as though they were the equivalent of a photograph. And that said, of course, many of you would likely shake your head because you realize how easy it is to manipulate photographs. When I think of Edward Curtis, and his whole oeuvre of recording the lives, again, of the last real Americans. It always has this declension narrative built into it, right? Of inevitable decline, of a terminal narrative. And Curtis is, at the turn of the century, he's busy taking photographs of Native people. And yet at the same time, we know that he airbrushes the photographs, he gives them the clothes he thinks that they should be wearing that make them more authentic than they really are. And so if you can manipulate photos like that, don't doubt for a moment that these paintings, though they may be very detailed and beautifully executed, are not a window that we want onto the past. And yet you can see why they might appear that way when you start to look at Bodmer's art. He is a remarkably talented watercolorist and draftsman. This is just one of his paintings from far up in Mandan country, the upper reaches of the Missouri, in a very bitterly cold winter they spent at Fort Clark in 1834. And there you see the watercolor that he did, the original. And then when he got back to Europe, he oversaw the translation of these watercolors into beautiful, high quality lithographs. And again, there are subtle changes made in those, and that would be a different conversation. But there's a sense that we are looking at, a kind of portal into the past. And it's especially true with some of the watercolors of figures. I'll start with these two because these are two of the first ones I ever saw up close and personal. I was the director of the Darcy Mcnichol Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies at the Newbury Library in Chicago. That's a private but publicly open research library that has a tremendous and amazing collection of visual materials as well as documentary materials on Native American. Any of you doing work in that area of study, I encourage you to look at the Newbury's website for things like fellowships there and research opportunities, because it really is a remarkable place. But anyway, we had some 40-something, 47, I believe, original watercolors by Bodmer from the 1830s. And they're just gorgeous things, as you can see. And part of what was so seductive about them, I thought, was their lack of narrative elements. They're as though that you're looking at the thing itself, right? There's nothing around it to give it a story. It's on a seemingly blank or neutral background, and it almost functions like a photograph, or from a scientific point of view, like a sample, or this is the object of study. And they're just gorgeous things. I've spent hours looking at them, and I could see why people were moved to think, I'm looking at the real thing, right? That they have a delicacy and warmth to the figures, and the minute detail in terms of the material elements of the clothing, the regalia, the objects they hold, their hair, everything gives us a kind of absolute faith in the accuracy of Bodmer. And it seems to be offered without commentary, which I think, again, shores up our ability to believe in him, as it were. And, I wish these were even better reproductions, because the colors look a little washed out to me in these slides. They're very vivid when you see them. And I think that's part of it, again, is that they're just striking. But at the same time, the more I did research on Bodmer while I was working with these items at the library, the more I kept coming across these testimonials or readings by art historians that claimed these were the most accurate, that they were uncannily accurate, that they stood apart from all other depictions of Native people in the period, etc. And while I recognized them as wonderful things, I began to get suspicious because I could feel in those comments something like that fetishized notion of authenticity, which seemed to be haunting the commentary. And when I say the fetishized notion of authenticity, I mean just that Native people suffer under the concept and the term authentic like no other people. We've got to be 110% Indian to be Indian in the eyes of the other. And so if you're not, wearing traditional regalia, you're not speaking your language, as many of us do not, because US society and education system spent decades beating languages out of us. That's why there were Indian boarding schools. And yet this notion of, oh, they're not really Indians, as though the only real Indians lived in the past. And people noted that for a long time, this has been a problem, that it's one thing to say the only good Indian is a dead Indian. But it's a very different thing to say the only real Indian is a dead Indian. And whenever I read these, oh, these are so authentic, I have this feeling of they're basically saying these were real Indians. And the people today, myself included, we would just be something like the inauthentic representatives of ourselves, which is a morally traumatic position to be put into. And so it's not a tenable position to be told, you're not real if you're living in the present because your people belong in the past. So whenever I heard this kind of, oh, they're so authentic, this is a window into the past, I was also made uneasy about this. Why is that so important? Why is that so wonderful about him? And the more I, encountered these critiques or these praises of Bodmer, I did finally find a few critiques in some German art historians who saw in Bodmer a fellow romantic from a Germanic culture, who they said the term they used was what they call nobilization. He ennobled his characters by refining features that he kind of had a tick for. He loved, an aquiline nose, the almond-shaped eyes, the strong chin, the extremely high cheekbones. And this would have appealed to his patron, of course. Prince Maximillian thought of them as, in all different terms, like knights of old, but always very romantic, right? That these were knights of the high plains. They represented the last untouched tribes and so on. And that was the other fantasy about them, is that, of course, they're not untouched, but to European culture. They've been dealing with Europeans since the early 18th century, in some cases the late 17th century, through voyageurs and fur traders from Courrier du Bois. And if one looks carefully, they exhibit the trade items and materials and glass beads and things that are part of an international trade that they are part of. But for Maximilian, he saw in them the last real Americans, as he wanted to. That was his goal. And I think Bodmer, to a certain extent, plays it up. The other thing I think, and this is, I could never prove it one way or the other, but I suspect that, as I said, he learns his craft of portraiture in the field. And there are certainly going to be phenotypical aspects, whether it be hair color, eye shape, skin tone, that he'll recognize as typical. And I think he uses them often as a shorthand. And so he comes to a stylized way of presenting Indigenous people of that region, because sometimes I think they look curiously the same, often, or almost interchangeable. He has a way of doing noses and eyes that these are paintings, two different cultures, two different native nations, a year apart, but the facial aspects are almost interchangeable. And he reminds me in certain ways, I don't have any pictures for comparison here, but if you know the American painter Charles Wilson Peale, who did a lot of portraits of the so-called founding fathers of the United States, so Washington and Jefferson and Knox and people like this, I can always tell a Peale from a mile away. I mean, he does faces very similarly to each other. He has a way of doing eyes that is typical of his work, right? And I don't worry that that's just his style. I don't think, well, is that really how General Knox looked? I think that's how Peale has him look, and that's how Peale paints. And I think there's a quality of that in the 23, 24-year-old Bodmer as he learns to paint figurative, people's faces, portraits in the field, as I said, as it were. The other time, we also know that a lot of these sketches were done quickly in pencil, and he would then work on them later as watercolors, because there's no tradition of portrait sitting in these cultures. A few characters we do know sat for an extended period of time, and or sometimes came back and wanted more portraits done of them. So, but that's the rarity. That's not, he does dozens of individuals, and we know that these people weren't sitting for hours in front of him as he got it just right. So I think that they are lovely pictures. They are beautifully rendered, but I think that we can also value them for other things. One of the things I really value them for is the incredibly meticulous way that he renders Indigenous material culture and Indigenous artisans' work, right? So in this portrait of Chancha Weituan, a Lakota woman, who he calls a Teton Sioux, she's wearing this beautiful buffalo robe, and with very distinctive design on it. And what's wonderful in this case, and in the case of some other objects depicted by Bodmer, is we have the very robe still in existence, right? So the photograph next to it is that same robe bought by Prince Maximillian from the owner, and brought back with his collection to Germany, and that's where it sits to this day at the Linden Museum in Stuttgart. But if you look carefully at it, you'll see some of these design elements, like this one here is right here. This box and border work, as it's come to be called by art historians, also tells us that because it was the tradition of many Plains Native people that men could do figurative work, i.e. horses and battle scenes and so on, in telling their stories, and women tended to do geometric work, like this, what's called a box and border design on the buffalo robe. So this is 99% sure made by a woman, possibly the woman depicted wearing it, though it could easily be a trade item. But I just think that here we have this wonderful sense of he is really a chronicler of this material culture. Much of it is lost, except for his incredibly meticulous rendering of it. And I think I would love to see as many of these things, kind of reunited, image and object, for us to really get a sense of his achievement, which I think is testimony to to the artistry of the people that he's depicting. And I'm sure he tries to do a decent job depicting the people. I have no question about that. But as I said, I'm just nervous about the continued insistence that these are like photographs. I just want to read you three very quick statements from more recent materials. Art historian Peter Boltz asserted that, quote, Bodmer's originals today still rank as the epitome in the depiction of other peoples in art and printmaking, end quote. Joan Tricoli described Bodmer's work as providing, quote, irreplaceable images of the appearance and activities of the Indians of the Upper Missouri, end quote. And William Getzman remarked that Bodmer is best known for his, quote, incredibly accurate and haunting pictures of Indians who lived along the Missouri River. And they are all those things in many ways, but it's that demand on accuracy, authenticity, it's hiding in there somewhere, and it needn't be there. Just the attention, the draftsman-like quality is fine, but it's this desire to have the people as equally well represented as the objects. I don't know that that's true. I don't feel it is. I just think we're incredibly lucky to have these viewpoints of these moments where he saw where he was taken with the beauty of the artistry of Indigenous people. And he really, I would say, celebrates it in ways that others don't. I think it's useful to, inevitably when you study Bodmer in an art history class, he's usually lumped together with George Catlin and Alfred Jacob Miller, and because they're all in the same region painting and all around the same time. Catlin or Bodmer's lithographs in Europe kind of take on a life of their own and play much more into a romanticized, created past of Native America. I mean, they really emphasize the exotic, the other. I sometimes think we have the term from Edward Said, Orientalism, about exoticizing and sexualizing the Eastern other, and I think this is a kind of Occidentalization where you have the West as the stand-in for the exotic, the appealing, the escape, the romance of it all. But I also want to think of Catlin and where he's different, because he's also a wonderful painter who does pay a lot of attention to the detail of material culture and its rendering. But what I do love about his portraits, and he's not near the draftsman in terms of artistry that Bodmer is when it comes to, say, painting full portraits. He has some problems with body proportion, Catlin. He's not very good at landscape, nothing near as talented as Bodmer. But in his actual bust style portraits, like these two, especially the one of Buffalo Bull's back fat, where he's staring right out at the viewer, that's part of what I love in Catlin, that they're real palpable individuals. In Bodmer, you almost never have a direct facial, looking out at the viewer. It's always profile or three-quarter stance, as though we're very much an outsider looking at an object of study. And here, the kind of subjectivity of Catlin's sitters is really what makes them so present and startling. I mean, I love them both, and I'm always happy when I'm teaching both of their work, because they each contribute something different. But this remarkable Buffalo Bull, the Pawnee warrior, just that is such a fantastic, just dead stare out at us, defiant, a thing I can't find in Bodmer, for all his excellence, I don't have this kind of interaction between myself and the subject of the painting. So they're both, I can see they're painting in the same years almost exactly, right? Catlin is a self-taught artist, and he starts out as a portrait painter. He paints miniature portraits, small for lockets and things that you would want to keep and that were affordable to middle-class people. And he starts out as a portrait painter, and then he gets in his mind he is going to become an Indian painter kind of as a business venture. And it's also telling, he has a very different, mentality about his subject than Bodmer, because he jumps into the fray with an agenda, and it's very much one he inherits as an American of the time, that he's dealing with a vanishing race, right? So he is, whether we call it a terminal narrative or declension narrative, he absolutely believes he's doing some salvage work, right? What later will be called salvage ethnography, that I'm just going to gather what we can before they disappear completely. And even if people didn't think Indigenous people would disappear, biologically, demographically, they did think our cultures would disappear as such, and then we would be kind of identityless. And so very telling that Catlin, when he goes out west, because he's seen portraits of Native people in Washington, D.C., Charles Bird King in the 1820s is painting all these wonderful portraits of visiting Native diplomats who are coming to Washington to negotiate treaties and other kind of actions with the government. And they'll often sit for Charles Bird King, who's creating this Indian gallery. Catlin greatly admired it, but he wanted to be out in the field where the real Indians were. And he didn't like that often the Native people that came to DC would dress in European style clothes when they went to see congressmen and that. He found that wrong. It wasn't authentic. And let me just, again, read you a quote, extremely telling from his own writings. He says of Native people, "I fly to their rescue, not of their lives or their race, for they are doomed and must perish, but to the rescuing of their looks and modes." So he makes it clear, we are on the way out. We are doomed and must perish, but he's at least going to save our image, our mode of life. And, when you start with that perspective, it's hard to see anyway beyond a romanticized but doomed cause for Indigenous life. So I don't think Bodmer has it. It's not something he's come thinking about or experiencing. He may get some talk of that from his patron. I'm sure that I think Prince Maximillian did have a notion of Native people as doomed and fated to fade away, that he probably said something about to Bodmer, but Bodmer doesn't come, that's not why he's come. He's come as a job to, really as one would join a natural science expedition to, he also records flora and fauna with equal accuracy and detail, as though he were a science book illustrator. So different perspectives on them in that regard. Also in Catlin, a thing that you don't get in Bodmer at all is a kind of visual critique. So people probably know this painting, a very famous painting of kind of this guy, Pigeon's Egghead, going to Washington. And you can see in the background, if this is clear, the Capitol building, without its dome yet, is there. So he's going to Washington and then returning home, and he's all fancified, dandied up with a parasol and a fan. He also has a bottle of liquor in his back pocket. He's been corrupted by his contact with civilization, and that's part of the nostalgia for the primitive that's so much part of Catlin's work. The other thing different about Catlin, of course, is he writes a lot about his experiences, and we have almost nothing from Bodmer except for those beautiful watercolors and the lithographs that will follow. When he returns, he doesn't have control, the type of control he would like over his own artwork, because that's his contract with Prince Maximillian, who oversees their production. Maximillian claims all of Bodmer's work is his property, as he paid for it, and Bodmer is allowed to make watercolor copies of his own art, and that's what we had at the Newbury Library. The other great collection, the majority of Bodmer's original work, is not in Germany, but is at the Joslin Museum of Art in Omaha, Nebraska, and a really fantastic collection of both the landscape watercolors and all the many portraits of Native people. But we don't have his words, and though he lives, into the 1890s, he never comes back to North America. He never returns to Native American subjects. He becomes a kind of Barbizon painter of, picturesque, scenes of rural France or something. But we don't have, whereas Catlin, we kind of know his thinking kind of all along, or at least how he reconstructs it. He's an invaluable part of this, the historical aspect, in the same way that Bodmer is, though for different reasons. Another painter often put side by side with them is Alfred Jacob Miller. He's the most trained, in a European sense, trained by an American, art academy while he was young in the States, and then he goes abroad and studies in Paris for a number of years. And you can really see the influence of Romantic painters, French Romantic painters like Delacroix, on his style. I always find him, when I put him next to Bodmer, I can't really even take him seriously. They're very narrative, or kind of softcore pornography with an Indian girl swinging. That always looks like something that should have been in a men's club in the turn of the century. I joked to a friend of mine that, Bodmer was interested in the clothes the women were wearing, not in getting them off them. But this is someone who was also in the same region in 1837, so about 5 years after Bodmer. He goes again with a European nobleman, this time a Scottish lord, William Drummond Stewart. It's funny that Miller does all these kind of heterosexist paintings, because Stewart's interest was almost exclusively in men. And he does paintings of mountain men aplenty as well. But so you have these, a collision of styles in the same region that couldn't be more different when I think of what Bodmer's doing and then what Miller's doing. And Miller's saying, look, I did this from life, but he does all his watercolors on the road. And then he produces these. If you look at the dates, they're much later than 1837, because he's doing these back in his studio in Baltimore for decades after his trip, and they seem to get further from him. I'm thinking that one of the things that the Bodmer project made me realize is I think we should spend more attention on lesser known figures than Catlin and Miller, and think about how Native peoples are being portrayed in this 1830s Indian removal period, because you have someone like James Otto Lewis, clearly not the talent that Bodmer or Catlin are, but also his genuine interest in portraying people in hybrid kind of fashion that they would have worn. This picture of Francis Godfrey from the Miamia people, the one on the right in the top coat, but also the intricately stitched leggings that he's wearing and moccasins. I love that just because he's not going, the artist is going, you know, to represent how this man puts himself forward and not some idealized notion of what a real Indian should be. And there's a whole portfolio of this work, as I said, not as elegant as the others, but equally valuable from a historical perspective. Some even lesser known ones, Baroness Wied-Neuwied, she's a French aristocrat, fled to the States after the French Revolution. She's in upstate New York in 1807, you know, doing these nice watercolors of local indigenous Haudenosaunee people, you know, my people. And I love that these things exist because, again, it's not about how accurate they are, but if we do want a viewpoint into the past, that these things go recorded and not prettified, or, you know, should make them wear a certain costume to look more specifically native. And then this other, I think George Winter, really one of the most underrated painters of Native Americans in the region of Indiana and Illinois, and these are 10 Potawatomi chiefs. Beautiful painting. This is Crystal Bridges, and I was very happy to see it there when it was there because his work is just not well known enough, and there's a lot of it, and a lot of it became etchings that are also beautiful and lithographs. And there's a whole range of materials that art historians have yet to really give serious attention to, or, you know, students like yourselves. And hopefully this will point you in some directions about considering those people as well, because they all, you know, they all add up to the larger sum of what was Native life in this really cataclysmic period of change in the United States, and how is it recorded? What's there for us to recover? What's been there all along, but escaping our notice because it's not as romantic as Bodmor or Catlin. So that's kind of where I am with this project, and I would welcome any questions or observations. Thank you very much. Nyawagoa.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks so much for your fascinating presentation. I'm going to now hand things over to Mindy Besaw, who is Curator of American Art and Director of Fellowships and Research at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. At Crystal Bridges, Mindy is leading institutional efforts to define and build Native American art programs and collections in collaboration with Indigenous scholars, tribal leadership, and Native individuals. So Mindy, I'm going to give you the floor, and maybe you can share some insights, and then also we can moderate some Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has a question, you can use the Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we can read those out loud and hopefully get some answers and some discussion going. So Mindy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And first, I would start by, again, thanking you, Scott, for what is so insightful, not just on Bodmer, but I think for especially all the students, young scholars, established scholars like myself, a word of caution about how we interpret, read, and write about imagery that could be based on past interpretations and then just really proliferating a legacy that can be quite impactful. So being more aware of how we're even talking about imagery. And another thing I was really struck by, and thank you for bringing in George Catlin and Miller to really hit home the differences in stylistic considerations and portrayals of the artwork, is also Catlin insists on that authenticity. And didn't he even have sitters or others witness his authenticity and even write, statements on the back of the painting to say, this is really what someone looked like?
Yeah, no, he is very concerned with that. Partly, it always strikes me as almost from a business point of view, right? I mean, he's very aware of his work as commodity. In fact, he'd like it to be more commodity than it was. And that was always his, he spends years trying to flog these paintings, which people are happy to see as a curiosity, but in the end, they don't want to own them, right? So it's like, I'd like to go look at it, but I don't want to own it. And that was always the problem.
Yes, and the other important thing I think that is so helpful to bring to the surface is all of the other context here, which is the intended audience, the motivation, that market versus being hired for a particular job and outcome, as well as circulation. And you mentioned circulation, especially in Europe, how the prints are just gobbled up for the images that they portray. And I would argue that these prints and the circulation have a lasting legacy that is unbelievable in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, as you're well aware, I'm sure that there's a long legacy of fascination with Native America in Germany in particular, where Prince Maximilian's from. And a lot of it is, of course, due to a popular German writer in the 19th century like Karl May, but even before that, Cooper was wildly popular. And you have to think, what are Native people standing in for to the German public? What's the fantasy? I always say to my students, if I lived in Germany in the Ruhr Valley during the Industrial Revolution, and I worked 12 hours a day in a factory making nails, I think reading about a world without hierarchy, without Herr Dr. Professor, without, who is the aristocrat in charge and all these things, that would just, and a kind of deep relationship to nature, which they were being more and more alienated from by these industrial jobs and industrial lives, that what could sound better than life on the plains on the back of a horse, just fantastic. And I think it really stood in at a moment when there was a craving for what was lost in European life and was reimagined as a possibility by Native people. And they got it through these prints, right? And looking at that Miller with the girl swinging on, that's, as I said, that's Occidentalism. It's as orientalizing as any picture of a odalisque, but it's the West and this fantasy of, of a free woman, naked and so on.
Yeah.
So it fascinates me. These images really have power.
Yeah, and the sliding scale of when romanticism is so obviously recognized in someone like Miller, and then all of the characteristics that you astutely point out that make Bodmer seem like a scientific observation, and how we read those parts, those details automatically. So I do have a question from the audience, and I will read it aloud. Do you think Bodmer denigrates his subjects at times by showing them slouching? This is at a time when posture and deportment is a sign of status in European culture. In early modern art, hunched posture is a way to denigrate the peasants.
That's an interesting, it's never struck me. But I know exactly what you mean. I don't notice it as much in him as I think of much later 19th century American artists like Krauss and others who paint Native people, always squatting. And I'm like, could they just not be squatting? Like, why is every person squatting? And it just, to me, it's like a weird tick. And I like that idea, though, of a kind of hierarchy of posture. I have to admit, I've never thought of it. But and I don't know, it's hard to know what Bodmer brings with him because he's really fairly provincial, right? He's from Zurich, but Zurich's a very small town in the early 19th century. It's not Berlin or London or Paris. And he's really kind of a rube, you know, when he comes. He's not trained at an academy, is trained by his uncle, who's a well-known artist in a local scene, but very different than some of these other figures, like Miller, right? Who's just so well-trained in a way.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And the squatting observation is also fascinating. And I did want to also mention, I hope there were many students paying attention to all of the dissertation topics that you were mentioning at the very end of your presentation. And glad to see the George Winter. I wonder, Scott, if there's also something about the location of the native peoples of the plains in the American West and the lasting imagery of particular tribes, such as Lakota, compared to, for example, painting in Indiana and with the George Winter, especially with the really distinctive head wraps, and how a feather is more automatically associated with Native peoples in what is now the United States than perhaps a different kind of regalia.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really does, it gets set at this time, right? What is an Indian? And so again, a lot of Native nations are not horse nations, right? My own included. So I'm sure by some point in the 19th century, Mohawk people owned horses, but probably more like farm horses. But we weren't riding around on the plain hunting buffalo. We're in upstate New York. And I think that's why I included that one little watercolor by Baroness Wied-Neuwied, because no one's painting Haudenosaunee people at that period, because we're done. Right, history has conquered us, rolled us over, and we're in the back now. But the plain, you know, Maximilian really has a fantasy that these groups are fairly untouched, and that's a fantasy, because there's a regular steamboat route up most of the Missouri by that point. Only when it gets too shallow to navigate do they go into wild country, but it's that same steamboat that will bring epidemic disease to that community just 2 years after Bodmer has left, and kill 90% of the population of some of the villages they painted. And, you know, both Maximilian and Bodmer are described as, you know, despairing, heartbroken. It's when news gets to Europe. But they, you know, there was that sense that the Plains Indians are the real Indians, right? They're and you get that as late as, you know, Frederick Remington, and he's painting into the early 1900s, and he's still obsessed with, you know, what he says about the Blackfeet. He says, my favorite kind of red, the Blackfeet. He says, they have all the elan of the ancient Mohawks, but you know, I'm just like, what are you talking? Yeah, but he's a man of his day, which thinks that's who you're going to go see in a cowboy and Indian show. You're not going to go see people from Indiana, right?
Right. And doesn't Remington uses his collection of largely plains objects to even illustrate a Longfellow?
Right. So what I find funny about the Longfellow, you know, so Hiawatha, Ionwatha is a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois name. He's a figure in our history. But Longfellow transposes him to the upper Great Lakes because he's kind of copying their folklore, which he learns through schoolcraft. And he realizes their main cultural hero's name is Nanabozo, which he doesn't like. He thinks it's too comic. So he brings the Iroquois name. And then later on, when a deluxe edition is illustrated by Remington many decades later, he says, I'm not going to depict people of the Great Lakes because they're too assimilated now, and they wear Western, you know, European clothes. So it's going to be Hiawatha, but they're all going to be Blackfeet. So it's like, okay,
So there are hierarchies amongst the authenticity, and that is even regional as well.
Well, I remember a person telling me, and I cannot find the reference, I'm afraid, but said that there was a art, exhibition in early 20th century New York City of someone displaying paintings of Navajo people. So obviously very Southwestern. And one of the critics in the newspapers said, how are these people Indian? They're not wearing headdresses. And he's told they don't. And he says, no feather, no Indian. And I feel like we've been battling that ever since. If you ask a little child to draw a stick figure of an Indian, how is it told it's an Indian? They have a feather,
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm looking at the time, and our time is up, but and I think the laughter about the feather is one of more awkwardness and just ridiculousness than it is actually a laughing matter. And I do wonder, Scott, if you would entertain one more question, and I'm leading to humor in this. And the question is, do you think we might consider Alfred Jacob Miller a humorist, not only in the sketches, but also in the paintings? In some paintings, he seems to take the vulgarity associated with Western humor of the mid-19th century and recast it according to the literary trope of a double entendre, which was so important to the comic imagery of the East Coast painters like William Sidney Mount. Wonder if Miller in relation to artists like Mount could be an interesting and productive comparison.
That would be, I find Miller interesting in a variety of ways. One is that he's very critical of Catlin. I don't think I've ever seen him say something about Bodmer. Bodmer is not really in his radar, but he calls Catlin a humbug. He says all this stuff about authenticity is kind of made up, so he clearly thinks he's doing something different. I don't think he thinks he's the corrective for Catlin, but in a way that the question seems to imply there's more artifice there. And I do believe that he's a sophisticated artist. He is, maybe to his discredit at times, but I can't hide. I am not a Miller fan, but it's more just stylistic. It's the soft focus. I don't like Vaseline on the lens or something. And but I do think he's a sophisticated person. I'm sure he has his reasons for doing, because I think there are a lot of playful jokes, especially given what we know of the sexual preference of his patron. All those mountain men lounging in the flowers together. I kind of think he's doing his own queering of things that appeals to Drummond Stewart's own interests. And I think, it's a really interesting question to think of how he saw those things.
Yeah, and going back to audience motivation, there's certainly something perhaps a little different than the images he makes for William Drummond Stewart versus the unending versions that come for the rest of his career.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So
yeah, he's a complicated artist.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I'm sure that I am echoing what our audience thinks when I said you have really given us lots to think about in the intentionality of how to speak about art, consider art, looking at, especially with Indigenous subject matter, but I think it's a good lesson across art history. And I thank you again so much for your time this evening.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye from Hungary. Bye.